Okay? On June 13, 2026, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, that a peace agreement with Iran will be signed on Sunday, June 14th, and that the Strait of Hormuz will immediately reopen for all ships. He also said this deal will prevent Iran from ever having a nuclear weapon. Every major news channel right now, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, is covering this the same way. They're all asking the same question. Will Iran sign? Will Trump sign? Is this finally the end of the war? Okay? That is the wrong question. And today I want to explain to you why that is the wrong question. Because while everyone is staring at Trump and Iran sitting across the table in some imaginary signing ceremony, nobody, and I mean nobody in the mainstream media, is asking the obvious question. What is Israel doing right now? And the answer, if you actually look at the news coming out of the ground in these past 48 hours, is this. Israel is bombing southern Lebanon. Right now, as we speak, the city of Nabatea. More than 20 villages. Israeli forces issued mass evacuation orders on June 12th and 13th. And the Israeli Air Force carried out heavy strikes targeting Hezbollah infrastructure. Hezbollah responded by firing rockets and drones into northern Israel. People died on both sides. This is happening on the exact same days that American and Iranian diplomats are telling the world a peace deal is just around the corner. Now, I want you to think about what that means. Because I think most people hear about the Lebanon bombing as a footnote. Oh, Israel and Hezbollah are fighting again. Yeah, that's just background noise. No, this is not background noise. This is the central contradiction that makes everything else collapse. And today I'm going to show you three things that almost no one is connecting together. Okay? The first thing is why Israel, a country that is not sitting at any negotiating table, that has signed nothing, that has agreed to nothing, is the actual reason no peace deal can survive. The second thing is why the 14-point Memorandum of Understanding that Iran and the United States are negotiating is not a peace deal. It is what I call a tactical pause. It is Iran buying time, getting economic oxygen, while quietly preparing for the next round of this conflict. And the third thing, and this is the one that matters most in the long run, the one that nobody is paying attention to, is why the Strait of Hormuz will never go back to what it was before this war. And what that means for the petrodollar, for the Gulf Cooperation Council, and for the entire financial architecture that the American empire has built since 1945. Okay? So this is a lot, but I promise you, if you stay with me through this, you will understand what is actually happening in the world right now in a way that most people simply do not. And again, this is my analysis. This is speculation. I could be wrong about some of this, but I'm going to give you the logic and you can judge for yourself. All right? Let's start with Israel. And I want to be very precise here because precision matters. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has made one thing absolutely clear in recent days. He said it directly in a phone call with President Trump. He said it publicly through his Defense Minister, Israel Katz. The message is this: Israel will not be a party to any agreement between the United States and Iran. And Israel will retain, quote, freedom of operational action in all arenas, including Lebanon, to protect its citizens and soldiers and prevent threats. Okay? Let that sink in. The United States is trying to broker a peace agreement with Iran. And one of America's closest allies, the country whose war with Iran's proxy network helped start this whole crisis, is publicly saying, we are not bound by whatever you two agree on. We will continue fighting whenever and wherever we choose. Now here's why this is fatal to any deal. One of Iran's core demands in the 14-point memorandum is a ceasefire on all fronts, specifically in Lebanon. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said it explicitly on Iranian state television on June 12th. Iran demands a permanent ceasefire in Lebanon. Iran demands Israeli forces withdraw from Lebanese territory, and he said, I'm quoting him, we have never forgotten Lebanon, and we will not abandon those who stood with us. Okay? So you have two positions that cannot coexist. Iran says the peace deal must include Lebanon, must include Hezbollah, must include an Israeli withdrawal. Israel says, we are not part of the deal. We will not withdraw. We will continue strikes. And what is America doing? America is in the middle, trying to hold both positions at once. Trump is apparently asking Netanyahu to restrain himself in Lebanon to help the negotiations. Netanyahu is ignoring him, literally ignoring the President of the United States, and continuing to bomb. Now think about the game theory here, okay? I talk about this all the time in class. When you analyze a negotiation, you need to understand not just the players at the table, but the players with the power to break the table. Israel is not at the table, but Israel has the power to break the table from the outside, and they are using that power every single day. But here is what makes this even more interesting. And this is something I have been arguing in this class for the past few semesters. This is not an accident. This fits perfectly into what I call the Greater Israel Project, okay? Israel's long-term strategic vision is to establish dominance over the entire Middle East, from the Nile to the Euphrates. And the way you achieve that vision is not by fighting every enemy yourself. The way you achieve it is by keeping your enemies fighting each other, keeping the region in permanent controlled chaos, and picking up territory and influence as the dust settles. From that perspective, a stable peace deal between America and Iran is actually bad for Israel, because a stable Iran is a powerful Iran, a weakened Iran, a divided Iran, and Iran still fighting a proxy war through Hezbollah, while also dealing with internal political collapse. That is a better situation for Israel's long-term strategy. So when Netanyahu says Israel will retain freedom of action, he is not just protecting Israeli security in the short term. He is protecting the strategic architecture that Israel has been building for decades. Does that make sense? All right. And here's the thing that should worry you most about the situation. America knows Netanyahu is undermining the deal. Trump is apparently furious about it. There was a direct conflict between Washington and Jerusalem over Lebanon, and Israel is still bombing. What does that tell you about the leverage America actually has over its closest ally in the Middle East? The answer is not much. And if America cannot get Israel to stop bombing for 48 hours to allow a peace deal to be signed, then any deal that is signed is a deal that Israel can blow up the moment it becomes inconvenient. That is the first reason why there is no sustainable peace here. Not the lack of a deal, not Iran's stubbornness. Israel is the wild card that no one is talking about. Okay? So let us assume for the sake of argument that somehow Israel decides to stand down. Just imagine that. Netanyahu picks up the phone and says, okay, fine, I will hold off on the Lebanon strikes for now. Would the deal work then? The answer is still no. And to understand why, I want to introduce a framework I want to call the tactical pause. Here's what I mean by that. A tactical pause is when one side in a conflict agrees to a temporary cessation of hostilities, not because they want peace, not because they have changed their strategic goals, but because they need to buy time. They need to recover economically. They need to rebuild military capacity. They need to wait for a more favorable moment, and then they will resume the conflict when conditions improve. Now, I'm not saying this because I am anti-Iran or because I am pro-America. I want to be clear about that. I'm saying this because the Iranians themselves are saying it, okay? Their own newspapers, their own officials. Let me give you the quotes. The Iranian newspaper Khorasan, not CNN, not Fox News, not the New York Times, but Khorasan, an Iranian newspaper, wrote this. The main function of this agreement is a breathing space and a chance to rebuild offensive and defensive combat power and prepare for a full-scale and major battle, end quote. Another Iranian newspaper, Kayhan, the hardline conservative daily, which is about as close to the supreme leader's worldview as you can get in Iranian media, published a front-page article titled, "We close the strait with power. We will not open it with diplomacy." And perhaps most revealing of all, before he died, the former Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei reportedly told his own supporters that the negotiations with America are, and again, I am quoting, just a delay until the Islamic Shiite state is established. He said this to his own people, not for Western consumption, for his own base. Now, a lot of people will say, okay, that's just hardliners talking, that doesn't represent the official government position. And they have a point. There is a genuine split inside Iran between the diplomatic faction, people like Foreign Minister Arakchi who are actually trying to negotiate, and the hardline IRGC faction that sees any compromise as a betrayal. But here is what I want you to understand about that split. The IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is not just a military force, it is an economic empire. It controls vast swaths of the Iranian economy through front companies and shadow networks. It has its own revenue streams that are largely independent of Iran's official economy. So when people say Iran needs to make a deal because its economy is collapsing, that logic applies to ordinary Iranian citizens, yes. It does not necessarily apply to the IRGC. They have resources, and they have guns. And in the end, the people with the guns make the final call. So what does the 14-point MO actually say, and why is it structured the way it is? Let me walk you through the 6 core deadlocks, okay? Deadlock number 1, the Strait of Hormuz. Trump is demanding the strait open immediately. Free for all ships, no conditions, no fees. Iran is demanding the right to, quote, manage the strait and collect service fees from passing ships. Arabji said directly, our sword will always hang over the Strait of Hormuz. These two positions cannot coexist. You cannot have a strait that is simultaneously free and open and subject to Iranian management fees. It is one or the other. Deadlock number 2, the uranium stockpile. The United States is demanding Iran dismantle its entire nuclear program and hand over its enriched uranium, what Trump calls nuclear dust, for destruction outside Iranian territory. Trump even threatened to send B-2 stealth bombers to physically retrieve it. Iran is only willing to dilute the uranium inside Iran. And here is the part that most people have missed. While these negotiations were ongoing, Iran was actively collapsing tunnels and placing explosive mines around the entrances to its nuclear facilities at Isfahan. CNN reported this based on 5 separate US intelligence sources. We are talking about roughly 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, enough for approximately 11 nuclear weapons, now buried under collapsed tunnels and surrounded by landmines. Think about what that action tells you. While your diplomats are talking about peace, your military is making the uranium physically impossible to retrieve. That is not the behavior of a country preparing to hand over its nuclear material. That is the behavior of a country preparing to hold on to it. Deadlock number 3, the sequencing problem. Iran is demanding that America lift its naval blockade and release $12 billion, half of the $24 billion in frozen Iranian assets, before any technical nuclear negotiations even begin. America's position, stated directly by Vice President J.D. Vance, is that no money will change hands and no blockade will be lifted just because Iran agrees to sit down at a table. The economic benefits will only come after Iran has fully demonstrated compliance. This is a chicken and egg problem with no solution. Both sides have perfectly rational reasons for their position. Neither side can move first without giving the other side an enormous advantage. Deadlock number 4, war reparations. The Iranian draft included a mechanism for the United States to compensate Iran for damage caused by American and Israeli strikes. Trump immediately listed the rejection of war reparations as one of his 5 non-negotiable preconditions for returning to the table. This is actually very revealing if you understand American diplomatic history. The United States never paid war reparations after Vietnam, despite having committed to reconstruction assistance in Article 21 of the Paris Peace Accords. They found legal and political reasons to avoid it. They will do the same here. The term war reparations is politically toxic in Washington in a way that is essentially irreversible. Deadlock number 5, the axis of resistance. America demands Iran stop funding and arming Hezbollah, Hamas, and its other proxy networks. Iran says it will never abandon Hezbollah. And while we are having this argument on paper, Israel is bombing Hezbollah on the ground right now, which makes the entire conversation about whether Iran will theoretically withdraw support almost irrelevant. And deadlock number 6, internal political fragmentation. This one is underreported, but I think it may be the most important. At the negotiating table, the Iranian diplomatic team is trying to make a deal. But back in Iran, hardliners are protesting outside foreign ministry offices, calling Arakchi a traitor and a compromiser. They are chanting for his resignation. The IRGC under General Ahmad Vahidi is actively working against the diplomatic team by leaking the contents of the Motu-friendly media outlets, specifically the Mehr News Agency, which is IRGC affiliated, in order to publicly commit Iran to maximalist positions that the diplomatic team never intended to make public. This is not a unified government negotiating strategy. This is a civil war within Iran's own foreign policy apparatus. And in Washington, it is not much better. Democratic senators are calling the deal a surrender document. Influential Republican senators like Roger Wicker and Lindsey Graham are calling for military escalation rather than negotiation. So when you add all of this together, the Israel problem, the 6 deadlocks, the internal fragmentations, the uranium fortification, what you are looking at is not a peace deal. You are looking at a tactical pause, a moment where both sides catch their breath. Iran gets some economic oxygen. Trump gets a ceremony. He can call a victory. And then in 60 days, when the technical negotiations inevitably collapse, we are back to where we started. Except Iran has used the 60 days to continue fortifying its nuclear sites, and America has used the 60 days to argue about who gets credit for whatever was agreed. The Iranian newspaper Khorasan said it best. The deal is not about nuclear weapons or Hormuz fees or any of the specific terms. The main function of the agreement is to postpone the final battle and give both sides time to rebuild for a larger confrontation ahead. Okay? Now I want to talk about the thing that matters most. And this is the thing that almost no one in mainstream media is paying attention to because they are too focused on the short-term drama of whether Trump and Iran will shake hands. The Strait of Hormuz will never go back to what it was before this war. Let me say that again. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow stretch of water, 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, where a strong swimmer could theoretically cross from one shore to the other, will never go back to the pre-war status quo. And that has consequences that go far beyond the Middle East. To understand why this matters so much, I need to explain something about how the American empire actually works, okay? And I know I have talked about this before, but it is important to connect it to what is happening right now. Why does the US dollar have value? Not because of gold. America abandoned the gold standard in 1971. The dollar has value for one specific reason. If you want to buy oil from the Gulf states, you have to pay in dollars. This is the petrodollar system. Saudi Arabia sells oil, receives dollars, and uses those dollars to buy US Treasury bonds and invest in American financial markets. The UAE does the same. Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain. This circular flow is the foundation of American financial power. It is what allows the United States to carry $39 trillion in national debt and still function as the world's reserve currency. Now, 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of everything. Japan imports 75% of its oil through that strait. China imports 40%. India imports 60%. The Japanese Prime Minister has publicly stated that if the strait closes, Japan runs out of oil within 8 to 9 months and the entire Japanese economy collapses. And here's the thing about the GCC countries that are at the center of this petrodollar system. They are extraordinarily fragile in ways that most people do not appreciate. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, these are desert nations. They import 80% of their food from outside the region. They get 60% of their fresh water from desalination plants. And a single Iranian drone costing $50,000 is capable of destroying a desalination plant. America's missile defense systems cost $1 to $3 million per interception attempt, and often they miss, which means you need to fire 2 or 3 missiles. So for every $50,000 drone Iran launches, America is spending $2 to $3 million to stop it. Think about what that asymmetry means over time. Iran can launch hundreds of drones per day. They have approximately 80,000 of them stockpiled, and they produce about 500 new ones every single day. America cannot sustain that rate of expenditure indefinitely. Nobody can. But here is the real question I want to ask. What happens if Iran never fully closes the strait, but simply makes it permanently uncertain? Not closed, just uncertain. Ships arrive and they are not sure if they will be fired upon. Insurance rates for tankers going through the strait go through the roof. Shipping companies start looking for alternative routes. The GCC oil trade becomes unreliable. Investment in the Gulf dries up. And gradually, slowly, the petrodollar system, that circular flow of oil for dollars that keeps American debt manageable, starts to corrode. And now look at what Iran is actually saying about Hormuz. Foreign Minister Araghchi said, and this is a direct quote, "Our sword will always hang over the Strait of Hormuz." The Iranian news agency Iran confirmed that the draft agreement contains, quote, "no commitment from Iran to give up management of the strait." An Iranian lawmaker publicly compared Iran's proposed Hormuz Management Bill to the oil nationalization of 1951. That was when Iran nationalized its oil industry and kicked out the British. This is not a throwaway comment. That comparison is deliberate. It is Iran saying, we are claiming permanent sovereign control over this waterway in the same way that we claimed control over our oil 70 years ago. And the Iranian parliament is now actively drafting legislation, officially titled a Bill for the Security, Development, and Progress of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, that would formally codify Iran's right to collect fees from passing ships. Okay, let me ask you something. What happens to the petrodollar system if Iran successfully establishes a permanent fee structure on Hormuz? What happens if Gulf oil now comes with a permanent Iranian surcharge? What happens to the dollar's reserve status when the oil trade it was built on becomes subject to Iranian gatekeeping? I am not saying the dollar collapses tomorrow. That is not how these things work. But what I am saying is this: the dollar's reserve status is built on the assumption that American military power guarantees free and open access to the world's energy supply. That guarantee is now being tested in real time. And so far, and I want to be honest about this, America's performance in this test has not been impressive. $39 trillion in debt, a naval blockade that cannot stop $50,000 drones, a closest ally that ignores direct presidential requests, a peace deal that has been announced 38 times in 2 months without ever materializing. These are the signs of an empire that is overextended, and Hormuz is the point where that overextension becomes most visible. Now, I want to be honest with you. I want to give you the best possible argument for the other side, because I think that is how you actually understand a situation. And I never want you to just accept what I say without thinking critically about it. The strongest argument for why a peace deal might actually work is this: both sides are genuinely exhausted. The Iranian economy is being strangled. Ordinary Iranians are suffering under the combination of the war, the blockade, and 2 decades of accumulated sanctions. Trump needs a political win. His domestic political situation requires him to be able to point to something he achieved that Obama and Biden never could. The global economy is bleeding because of Hormuz. European manufacturers who depend on Gulf energy, Japanese corporations running out of reserves, Chinese factories watching their supply chains deteriorate. All of these forces are creating enormous pressure on both governments to find some kind of agreement, even an imperfect one. And there's a real argument to be made, and smart people at organizations like the Erasure Group are making it, that if both sides formally declare this the end of the war, it becomes politically much harder for either side to return to active hostilities. There is a ratchet effect. Once you have signed something, even something ambiguous, the political cost of going back to war increases. That has real value, okay? That argument is not stupid. I respect it. But here is what that argument cannot account for. The IRGC does not need the Iranian economy to recover. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has built a parallel economic empire over decades. Construction companies, logistics networks, import monopolies, shadow financial systems, they have revenue streams that operate largely outside the Iranian state budget. When Iran's economy collapses, ordinary Iranians suffer. IRGC generals do not suffer in the same way. Their institutional survival is not dependent on economic recovery. And the IRGC has already shown you what they think of this deal. They leaked the contents of the move to their own media outlets specifically to sabotage the diplomatic team. Protesters aligned with IRGC-friendly factions showed up outside the foreign ministry in Mashhad, chanting "Death to the compromiser" and calling for Araghchi's resignation. The judiciary chief, who is not a diplomat, he is the man who controls who gets arrested in Iran, publicly stated that Iran's confrontation with America will have no end except with the uprooting of oppression and arrogance. When the man who controls the prison system of your country says the war is not over, and the military force that actually controls the country's hard power says we are not surrendering, a piece of paper signed in Islamabad does not change the strategic reality. Always trust actions over words. Iran is mining its uranium tunnels. That is an action. That is telling you something. Alright, so let me give you 3 specific things to watch in the next 48 to 72 hours. Okay? Because I think one of the most useful things I can do for you is not just explain what is happening, but give you a framework to test against reality in real time. Prediction number 1. If the Memorandum of Understanding is signed, either Sunday or early next week, watch what happens in the following 24 hours. Trump will describe it one way. Iran will describe it a completely different way. The Americans will say Hormuz is opening immediately. Iran has agreed to give up its nuclear material. This is a total American victory. The Iranians will say they are retaining management rights over Hormuz. The uranium remains in Iran, and they have secured the release of frozen assets. When you see those two descriptions existing simultaneously, and I am telling you right now, that is exactly what will happen. You are looking at confirmation that this is a tactical pause, not a peace deal. Both sides are selling incompatible versions of the same ambiguous document to their own domestic audiences. Prediction number 2. Watch Israel in the first 48 hours after any signing. If, and I expect this, Israel continues military operations in Lebanon after the MOU is signed, and Hezbollah continues to respond, and Iran says nothing about withdrawing its support from Hezbollah, then the core contradiction I described in part 1 will have been confirmed on the ground. The deal will have been already broken, because one of Iran's fundamental conditions, a comprehensive regional ceasefire, will have been violated by a party that never agreed to anything. Prediction number 3. Watch the Iranian parliament. There is a Hormuz management bill currently moving through Iranian legislative channels. If that bill passes, even after a peace deal is signed, it means Iran is locking in permanent legal authority over Hormuz as a matter of domestic law, not as a diplomatic position, as a statute. And a statute is much harder to roll back than a negotiating stance. If that bill passes, the pre-war status of Hormuz is gone permanently. Whatever the MOU says is irrelevant. The legal architecture for Iran to charge fees and exercise management rights will have been embedded into Iranian law. Now I want to give you your homework, and I mean this seriously. Do not just watch the news about whether the deal gets signed. Go read the statement made by Iran's Judiciary Chief Gholam Hossein Mohsen on June 13, 2026. He is not a diplomat. He is not a general. He is the man who controls whether Iran's negotiators get arrested if they agree to too much. Read what he said about the confrontation with America having no end, and then ask yourself, what does it mean when the person with the power to imprison the peace negotiators says there will be no peace? Then read the front page of Kayhan newspaper, the hardline Iranian daily, that is as close to a direct mouthpiece of hardline ideology as you can get, and read their articles saying Hormuz was closed with power and will not be open with diplomacy. And ask yourself, are these the voices of a country that is genuinely ending a war? Or are these the voices of a country that is strategically choosing to pause one phase of a much longer conflict? And if you think my analysis is wrong, and I welcome that, I genuinely welcome it, then find me evidence that Netanyahu has agreed to any binding constraint on Israeli military action in Lebanon. Find me evidence that the IRGC has endorsed the MOU. Find me a single quote from a senior Iranian military official saying Iran is willing to give up physical control of its enriched uranium. I do not think you will find those quotes, because they do not exist. But I could be wrong. I am always open to being wrong. Okay, let me leave you with this. Every channel right now is asking whether Trump and Iran will sign a piece of paper, and I understand why. It is dramatic. It is immediate. It gives you something concrete to report on. But the real story is not whether the paper gets signed. The real story is what happens in the 60 days after it is signed, when all the irresolvable contradictions I described to you today come crashing back into view. Israel is not bound. Iran's uranium is buried under mines. Hormuz will never be free again. The petrodollar is slowly hemorrhaging. And somewhere in the tunnels of Isfahan, under collapsed rock and explosive charges, sits enough enriched uranium to change the course of world history. When Israel is still bombing Lebanon, Iran is fortifying its nuclear sites. And Hormuz is being transformed from a free waterway into a managed toll road. The real question is not whether a memorandum of understanding gets signed on Sunday. The real question is this: which side is using this pause to prepare more effectively for what comes next? And how many more announcements of imminent peace deals will we hear before the world finally admits that this war is nowhere near over? I will see you in the next lecture.